So welcome everyone. I just want to thank you for being here. It's quite magical to be here with these two beautiful women. I'm in New York, Rose is in California, and Anjhula is in Bombay, India. And it has not been without trials and tribulations, but it's still a pretty magical world we live in, that we can be in these locations and have all of you join us. So this is certain to be a terrific conversation. We had a test call where these two wonderful women got to meet each other. Anjhula was in Kuala Lumpur during that call. And so this is the first time we've all gotten to see each other, thanks to modern technology. But I just want to thank you all. Today's conversation is about across the continents and religious traditions to explore the intersection of faith and philanthropy in the spirit of money. And before we introduce our lovely callers, hostesses, I would like to just give a little bit of overview about Boulder Giving. If anyone's not familiar with who we are and what we do, we're a small nonprofit based here in New York, and we have a pretty mighty mission of inspiring people to give to their full lifetime potentials. And we do that through storytelling, through the stories of wonderful philanthropists such as Anjhula and Rose. Our mission is to inspire, support people to give more, risk more, and inspire more. So if you are a bold giver, someone who's giving 20% or more, or has, or aspires to, we'd encourage you to let us know so we can share your story, or if you know someone who is. We have initiatives on things such as bold investing, so people can align their investments with their values. We have an initiative on environmental justice. We do some LGBTQ work for National Give Out Day. That'll be May 21st this year, supporting all the LGBTQ organizations across the globe. And we also have a program on global giving, mostly based in Eastern Europe right now. So if you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to call myself, Jason, or Otar. As I said, we're a pretty small team. But our mission today is to, first I'm going to ask Rose and Anjhula to share a little bit about their stories and ask them some questions and have just a pretty casual conversation about how their faith influenced their giving and their relationships to money. If you haven't had a chance to read their bios, they are both on the Boulder Giving website, and I'm sure you'll be moved. So feel free to post your questions throughout the call. Everyone can't see your questions, only Rose, Anjhula, and I can see them, but we'll get to as many questions as we can if they aren't addressed through the conversation. And it's a non-solicitation space, so we won't be asking any questions about specific organizations other than to highlight the organizations that Rose and Anjhula are involved in. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Rose. Rose channeled her Catholic faith to engage with money as a spiritual practice and sought something deeper within her faith that could hold in the face of injustice. At Harvest Time, an organization she leads, she created a safe space for peers to talk about money and Christian faith. They do lots of gatherings, and it's a wonderful community. Several of the Harvest Time members are on our Bold Giving website. So Rose, I understand you were brought up in a pretty traditional Irish Catholic family. I'd love it if you'd share some information about your background and how your faith and spirituality present in your giving today.
Yes. Yes, so I grew up in an Irish Catholic family, as you said, in New York, in Westchester. And we grew up in a somewhat affluent neighborhood, so we had a lot of the benefits that came from that reality, particularly education and just having our needs cared for, plus a lot more. But the striking thing about the family that I grew up in was that even though we were in that context, my parents' Catholic faith was such an important part of who they are that there were several things that they did differently from the culture all around us. And I'm mentioning them because I feel like now I understand how deeply their example was a part of my own development of just my own interest in giving. So some of the things that they did differently was we lived in a world where there was a lot of emphasis on external things that bring status, cars and jewelry and clothing and things like that. And my parents just had this very clear sense that those were not the things that mattered. And it wasn't like they were moving against those things, but it's just that's not what they thought about. So they thought more about integrity and character and generosity and giving back to the community. And my dad did that a lot through his career in New York City. As a child, what I saw was my mom, just, at this time of year where there's a lot of food drives and clothing drives. My mom was always the one to fill up the car. So we weren't given a bag to bring to school, but just she would drive us to school on that day with just bags of groceries to bring in. And, as a kid, I was just horribly embarrassed by that because we were different from everybody else. And yet, as an adult, I just realized that really taught me something about that my parents just took seriously, that in Christianity, there's such a clear mandate to care for those who are struggling. And so I just saw that, on those rides to school with my mom. So that was really the context that I grew up in. If you can imagine being in an affluent world and yet with parents who didn't really care much about cars or clothes or those kinds of things, but cared about character and integrity. That was the context that I was raised in. And then I went on to study with the Jesuits in college. And there too, I just learned much more about the social justice dimension of Catholic teaching. And so those were just those early formative influences. And through the Jesuits, they had I remember my very first math at Georgetown University, one of the Jesuits said to us, "From those to whom much has been given, much will be expected." And he was quoting a line from the Gospels. And he just really told us from jump, you're at this incredible university and you're not here just for yourself, but as a way to give back. And so my freshman year, I signed up, and every Friday I worked with women who were homeless 2 miles away on 14th Street in Washington, D.C. And so I was getting my education in the classroom, and then I was getting my education by taking that bus ride 2 miles from a very wealthy neighborhood into a very poor neighborhood and just trying to help women who were pregnant have access to health care and housing. So those were all just sort of part of the mix of what I grew up in that came out of my Catholic faith. So that then when I became an adult and received some money, I understood that it was there as something to give back. So it wasn't really just for me, but it was somehow I had to work with that as part of my Catholic faith. So that's a much longer story, but hopefully that just gives a little bit of background as to how I got into this conversation.
Thank you, Rose. There's much more to this story. So Anjhula Maya Singh Bas is a next-generation philanthropist, a successful Indian model, and is working on her PhD in international psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She's embraced the responsibility of being born into a wealthy Hindu family and embarked on a personal spiritual journey through teachings of Buddhism to seek spiritual value in money. Through these experiences, she and her husband founded the help me out, Anjhula.
Selvanathan.
Selvanathan Foundation aimed at corruption and supportive action for a host of anti-corruption activities and pro-humanity endeavors in India and around the world, especially with an emphasis on Sri Lanka, I understand. So Anjhula, I understand that you were brought up in a traditional Hindu faith and then after a pretty awful tragedy embraced Buddhism as an adult. You and your husband both are practicing Buddhists, and I'd love to hear a little bit about your background and your faith and spirituality and how it's led you on this journey in philanthropy.
Sure. First of all, thank you for having us. It's an absolute honor to be sharing space and having dialogue with Rose. And I'm so happy that I can see you both, given the connectivity issues as we connect globally. But, I think if I were to describe myself in my background, it's a curious concoction of free will, environment, parenting, karma, I've been schooled in the West, schooled in the East. I always felt a bit too Western for this part of the world and a bit too Eastern for perhaps for the West. But and interestingly enough, just like Rose was saying, her parents obviously had quite an impact on her, and both my mother and my father were examples of different styles of giving and of being in philanthropy. One of my earliest memories is my mother going on religious Hindu pilgrimages in India and sort of anonymously putting heavy quilts on homeless people. It was very, very cold because it was near the Himalaya mountains. So there was an example of anonymous giving. My father's had a very interesting trajectory as well. So my father is an Indian noble, and in India you will have, the village people or the subjects come to you with any issues. So he will literally hold court, and probably that is an example of, earliest example of listening and actually, not just literally sitting on a throne, but actually being proactive. And I think that probably gave rise to my eventual going into psychology and being a listener. And then, maybe with serendipity or whatever, but then I got into the field of, showbiz and entertainment. And that was really awakening because so then I have my psychology background intersecting with media, and very interesting, like I'll be doing field work in West Africa, like Sierra Leone, Liberia, post-war countries, tackling with really, really tough issues, namely, for example, female genital mutilation, forgiveness work. And I would have a driver or a taxi person in West Africa, of all places, ask me, if I know the latest Bollywood song. And I just realized over the years, for me, when I was doing my undergraduate, a modeling assignment was a modeling assignment. But then as I grew, I realized, like Rose kind of alluded to, like what our professor was saying, with great power comes great responsibility, and the sort of message that you can affect or impact you can have as a celebrity or someone in the media, it's very, very interesting, and I hold that very carefully. And I guess where I sort of diverged a little bit on my own path, being the black sheep of the family in a way, is like you mentioned, my parents are both devout Hindus. They've built temples in India and in the U.S. But one thing I realized is I didn't really feel like anybody was in the driver's seat. In India, or like in Hinduism, it's sort of very much based on a caste system and being sort of resigned to your fate. This is my karma and I take it. But Buddhism teaches a slightly but very profoundly different message, which is everybody's in their own driver's seat, and you can, a change in a person reflects in the environment. So, constantly this is wrong with the environment, that's wrong. If you change yourself, there'll be ripple effects. And I guess, at this point, I probably most align myself with the Nike motto, just do it. So you see so much, so much going on, a lot of bureaucracy, corruption, especially, I'll go out to say, in this part of the world. So we started our foundation, and it's grassroots. We're just, as two citizens, me, myself, and my husband, we won't wait for the government. We won't wait for the police. At times, they may or may not be, effective. So having, living in a country with a billion people, it tends to put a different perspective. So that's where I am right now.
Thank you. And I guess I'd like to know how your faith guides your personal giving and your relationship to money. Rose, could you talk a little bit about that and the spirit of money?
Sure. Yeah. So, what I shared earlier was really sort of the background of how I even got to where money was a question in my life, sort of coming out of that sense of the social justice teaching of Christianity and then finding myself as somebody who had money. So that was sort of how I came to it as a question. And I absolutely understood that, my faith needed to sort of, that my financial life and my faith life needed to be in dialogue. So sometimes I've observed that sometimes people separate those, but for me, they were never separate. If I'm to be living my faith in my life, then it also impacts how I choose to use money. So very early on in the journey, what I understood was I'm struck, actually, Anjhula, listening to your story about your mother and your father, because actually I gave the example of my mother, but my father is one of the fields of law that he's an expert in is arbitration. So he's also someone who listens. I don't know, somebody could do a study on us out there, but just, just to say that I started following my mother's example of just using money to respond to just really pressing immediate survival needs. So helping people to have access to housing, to food, just basic survival. So that definitely that's sort of a foundational part of my giving. And just looking at the philanthropy side of my money life. But as I got into that, I started to understand, the more you are engaged in responding to immediate needs, or the more I was, I came to just really be reading and studying about the issues, and particularly in Haiti. That was one of the places I was engaged. And I came to understand that there's a global economic system in place, that people don't just end up poor or having a hard time getting access to education or to healthcare. Those aren't accidents. They're not because people are lazy, which is one of the messages that I heard growing up. But there's actually an economic system in place. And what I came to see was that actually, while some people were suffered as a result of that system, and that was painful for me to see, I also recognized that some people benefited from that system, and actually that was me. And so I started off wanting to respond to, putting my giving towards people who were just to help them meet their needs, and I still do that. But I came to understand that actually life, for whatever reason, had planted me in the neighborhoods of wealth. And another way to work to sort of try to shift that system was actually to see if I could figure out a different way to live myself. So so really then I started to say, how can I be in relationship to money in a way that will help to create more social justice in the world, starting with myself? So that really was my question about money. What would that look like specifically in my giving, also in my investing, in how much I choose to hold on to, in where I shop? Those were all questions that were sourced from that fundamental sort of Christian desire to create a world where people's basic needs are met and people can thrive. So I understood that as just core to the gospel, but also core to the gospel was you can't just focus only on those immediate needs. You also have to look at what's causing them. So that was the systemic shift place. But then as I got into that journey, I realized that there can be an impulse in me that when I'm trying to respond to sort of injustice, that's coming from what I now would call an ego place, sort of an ordinary thinking place. And at a certain point along the way, I discovered the story of Mary of Bethany, who is this woman in the gospel story who she makes a gift to Jesus right before he enters into Jerusalem for the last time, where he's going to die. And she gives him just this extravagant gift that one of Jesus's other followers, Judas, criticizes her for doing. And he says, really, you should have sold that and given the money to the poor. It's a good critique. And yet there is something about her offering of the spirit of love, the extravagance in it, that Jesus affirms. He stays with Mary. And as I really listened to her story, something happened for me. And I came to understand that in addition to my money needing to serve just the immediate needs and also serve to be part of shifting systems, actually even more than that, I wanted whatever money I have to really participate in that kind of a love that is extravagant, that's in response to Christ, that just pours everything out. So then the question was, how can my money be about that? So those were sort of some of the places where I started to think about money in light of the Christian tradition. And so now, what I ended up doing was I ended up giving away a lot of the money that I received as a young adult. I was very much drawn to simplicity as a path. And along the way, what I learned was that actually all of the money that comes to me is gift, whether it's through my work or through gifts or whatever, it's all gift. So then how can everything that I do with it move from that Mary of Bethany place of just response to Christ in my life? So it's about my giving, but it's about everything. It's about the investing, spending. But how can that move in service to love?
It's wonderful. Anjhula, do you have anything? Does that bring up anything for you?
Yes, it does, completely. I'm smiling because I relate to almost all of it. And it is so beautiful to hear the same essence in a way just expressed, and manifest in different circumstances, different parts of the world. But so, also from a Buddhist perspective, faith equals daily life. They say Buddhism takes place in society. It's not a separate reality. As a Buddhist, it's not only about, it is, of course, interconnectedness. I'm very concerned about thoughts, words, and deeds. And sort of some of the principles I wouldn't even say Buddhist giving, it's just a Buddhist way of life. Like Rose was saying, there's sort of no, as she's explaining, there's no separateness. It's everything is in dialogue with one another. But definitely from what I've read, what I've experienced in my life as a Buddhist, sustainability, justice, ethics, these are all sort of themes underlying giving and philanthropy. I think too often it's easy to maybe sign a check or just give sort of down to, but a more Buddhist way of interacting with others is empowerment, working side by side. The inherent dignity in everyone's life is very, very important in the Buddhist philosophy. And just like Rose was describing a sort of parable or a story in the Christian faith, the Buddha talks about the intent of offering. So there's sort of a parable of how a very rich, a very wealthy prince gave tons of offerings, of gold. And a very, very poor woman she didn't have anything, so she gave a pie that was made out of mud. But it's the spirit and the intent or the love that infuses everything and sends out a vibration. So that's kind of what sort of underlines the Buddhist way of giving and being, most importantly. And the thing is, I'll say really quickly, I always laugh. I tease my friends sort of in India. Our happiness is inextricably linked with others. So, especially in India, it's just so obvious. You'll have a beautiful house juxtaposed next to a slum, and you wake up every day seeing that. Or you have a Mercedes or a Rolls Royce, and I start laughing. I'm like, you have this in the garage, but you can't even drive it down the road because the road is not even paved, and that's because the politicians are taking the money. And so, our faith is inextricably linked with one another. And when we can get that, we work for ourselves and others' happiness in tandem. So.
Thank you. We have a question here from Sean, who says, I'm moved by the stories of faith shaping lives and motivating giving, but what happens when tough decisions have to be made and faith doesn't offer clear guidance, or when faith traditions seem to conflict with the reality of the needs and priorities at hand? So either of you want to tackle that? Thank you, Sean.
Mm-hmm. Rose, you want to go first, or should I take a stab at it?
Go for it, and then I can as well. Yeah, go for it.
Well, one part of me says that in a way, I'm a voracious, this is just me, this part of me speaking very personally. I am a voracious reader, and I believe that anything that we human beings sometimes tend to think that what we're going through is extremely unique, but I don't think it has not been experienced before in the world. And I've always been able, when I put the intent out there and the vibration, I feel like I've always been able to find an answer in a book. But more than that, coming from my faith, like a sort of Buddhist Eastern perspective, I feel every human being is endowed with a higher knowing, an intuition, a gut, a consciousness. Decisions won't be easy. That is the harsh reality of life. But I think if we can sort of dig deep, sit in silence, the right answer at the right time for the right situation, it will come to you. May not be easy, but it'll be the right thing at that time. The universe hasn't let me down yet.
Rose?
So first of all, I love the question because I feel like what I just spoke to was really the big vision of what I'm going for. And that's real. And of course, that vision is lived out every day in the sort of the messiness of life, where it's sort of just in figuring it out in every moment that we actually manifest that vision. And actually in the living of it, it's often not as simple as what it just maybe sounded like I just said. So I really appreciate the question. And I would say simply, so part of me would want to know a little bit more about what specifically you were speaking to. So obviously in this forum, that's hard. But so what comes up for me as I listen to the question, though, is that in my faith tradition, I think actually there is something that can help with those hard decisions, which is, I mentioned that I was trained by the Jesuits, and they have a very solid tradition of teaching discernment. So I feel like part of it is not just understanding the philosophical principles that are present in the tradition, but there are practices. And Anjhula, I know you were just speaking to a certain kind of listening where you actually can pick up on the cues that come from the universe. And I would say also in Christianity, we have very, very solid traditions of discernment. And discernment is what happens right inside of those hard questions. So in that place, I don't actually feel separate from the tradition. That's the place where I lean into it. And the discernment, it has to do with listening deeply to the inner heart, which means to get to that knowing, I often have to sort through all the other voices in my head. And therein is the challenge and all the other poles. So for example, just to bring it very specific, in the world of my own experience of giving, one of the things that happens for me is it's very hard for me to see someone, particularly a friend, who is suffering and is going through a hard time. And I have a natural instinct to want to respond. That's a good thing. The question is, sometimes I want to do for people what really is not mine to do. That we call codependency. But that pull can be very strong. And I have made gifts that come from that kind of a desire. And that's a hard one for me, to really, when really my giving then is taking care of my own pain about seeing somebody else in need. Sometimes it is me who's to respond to that. But I think when it's coming from a sort of a guilt drive or a codependent drive, it's really not about that other person. It's about my need. I'm giving that as just one example of a very, very tricky place where we have to listen very clearly and be just totally real with ourselves about where is this instinct to give coming from? Is it coming from a place of guilt, or is it coming from a place of shame, or is it really coming from a clear discernment that this is the one thing for me to do right now in this moment? So those kinds of decisions I absolutely can be very tough. And I think the spiritual traditions do have guidance for how to really listen in them. The other thing I would say comes into play in my own Christian experience is the role of community. So I'm so glad that I have friends I call. So when I hit those hard decisions, I have friends I call to say, can you listen with me to this decision I have to make? And so I can really hear, just really in the place of community, find the inner wisdom. So absolutely, there's hard decisions that come into play in the living out of these visions. And I, in my own experience, again, is that actually the traditions do have something that can help as we step into the messiness of what it means to live the big vision in day-to-day life.
Well, and you talk about just trying to live simply in the neighborhood that you live in, Rose, so that your
Yeah,
boys can go to school. I mean, every day you're faced with these challenges. And
absolutely.
Anjhula, I mean, you have such a high visibility. You must be called on. There must be conflicts that present themselves on a regular basis when you're modeling and on the runway and on a fashion week and.
Yes. It reminds me of Aesop's fable. One of Aesop's fables. If you try to please everyone, you end up pleasing no one. So I think always a message across any faith is know thyself.
Yeah.
I think who wouldn't want to be the best version of yourself, right? Because there's only one of you. But I think especially when you're in the media, you have to have even, sort of a more not ironclad, that sounds decidedly non-Buddhist, a very strong core about who you are and where you want to go. Otherwise, you can be swayed way too easily. There is more importance, like, for example, fairness creams in this part of the world are a very big deal. It's like a multi-billion-dollar industry where you sort of put these harsh chemicals on your face in these creams because, fairness is a virtue. And if you're dark, it's this sort of post-colonial hangover. And I always laugh because all my friends in the States are trying to get my tan. And here in India, everybody's trying, it's just, it's a bit reversed. But my point is, I understand the visibility thing. I refuse to endorse it, and it's extremely gratifying when, I have a 15-year-old writing to me saying, I've always been told that I'm too dark, no one will marry me, and, you're leading by example. And then, just to go back again in my faith, it's non-attachment to everything. So sort of just being mindful in the present moment. And, as far as that's concerned in terms of giving or philanthropy, I feel very fortunate that my husband and I are very much on the same page about that. And, we like to give it all away, whatever we have or continue to earn. It's just, there's a different way I feel that to approach life and not be bogged down of accumulation. And sorry, and just to go back to the question that was posed, I just wanted to piggyback really quickly on what Rose says, because I think it's very, very important. She's absolutely right about the sense of community, especially in this day and age. For all the technology that's supposed to make life faster and, more accessible, there's a great increase in isolation and loneliness. And also in the Buddhist faith, definitely there's the opportunity to receive guidance, but just what we call the Sangha or the community is so important. So please always reach out, whether it's a neighbor or someone it's a good place. The world is a good place. There'll be someone that's there to listen or lend an ear.
So Sean just commented and he said, what I'm hearing is that this requires you to have, paradoxically, both humility and knowing yourself and confidence in the quality of your decision making, even when it might appear to contradict what institutions seem to prescribe.
Yeah. Well said.
And here's a comment from someone who wishes to remain anonymous in Massachusetts. Says, I've been in philanthropy for 30 years and have evolved many personal platitudes. One is, donors need to see themselves first as investors because no man is an island. Being rich means nothing if one is unable to plug into the sea of humanity of which they are, after all, a part of. Given this backdrop, how do you navigate the sliding scope of true motivation that comes from the spiritual dimension versus other forms of personal motivation? As a philanthropist myself, I arrived at a point in my efforts when I caught myself having to address and deal with my true motivation. So I'm asking the same of both of you. And I know you already addressed this a little bit, Rose, when you said you turned back into your faith. Is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah. So that's great stuff. And I feel like, first of all, just the fact that the questions being asked is great. I mentioned earlier that one of the tools that comes out of the tradition I was raised in is the tool of discernment. But actually, I would say in harvest time circles, we are very clear about teaching spiritual practice. And part of the reason for that is exactly in response to the question being raised. So the particular, in other words, how do you really make the decisions that flow from the truest motivation? And we know that the inner life of a human being can be a very complicated maze. So first of all, I want to say I'm not somebody who believes we have to do any of this perfectly. So I feel like we can just hold ourselves with great compassion and do our best and learn. And sometimes the biggest mistakes we make are great teachers. So just to kind of hold it in a place of compassion, first of all. We're not going for perfection. But secondly, I would say one of the pieces we teach now in harvest time is really contemplative spiritual practice, which is very much aligned with mindfulness I know the Buddhist practice, which is fundamentally what we're trying to do is to drop from what I'm calling the egoic self into the inner heart, which is where we would say where God speaks, where we are in the presence of the divine. But we don't just get there because we want to be there. Sometimes we do. There's a moment of grace that opens up. But in general, we engage in spiritual practices as a practice of continually listening to those inner voices and letting them go. So in that process, we develop that part of ourselves that can witness the inner voices. We strengthen the faculty of watching what are the voices that are coming. And then also at the same time, we learn the practice of surrendering into the place of love. So this is a deep inner practice, and we could be here for a long time just talking about that. That was a summary. But mostly I'm saying I feel like spiritual practice is really key for rewiring the insides of us. That's one part. Another practice that Harvest Time works with is taught by an organization called Be Present. And that I just find to be an incredible tool for looking at it's our unconscious ways that we've internalized, some of the culture's voices around, in my case, being somebody who comes from a background of wealth and who also has white skin and is a woman. So what are some of the messages that are sort of wired into my own being as a result of growing up in this culture? Those are not necessarily aligned with my spirit. So the Be Present practice is really how do I become very familiar with those places of unconsciousness and bring them to consciousness, so that I can really live much more from that place of my inner spirit. So mostly my answer to this is I feel like the spiritual practices are an important component of training ourselves so that we just become more and more of a conduit for that place of love.
Thank you. Anjhula, anything to add?
Well said, Rose. You said it all. I'm very impressed by the intersection of how you're describing in your faith that the discernment and listening to the inner voice. So same in Buddhism. In Nichiren, the Nichiren school of Buddhism, we have a mantra, Nam-myoho Renge Kyo, which loosely translated means I devote myself to the mystic law of cause and effect. So that's an underlying principle, the causes and effects that we're making, again, as I mentioned, in thought, word, and deed. And when you chant, as we do in Buddhism, it's remarkable how that automatically becomes a sort of self-filtering system. There will be times when I'm chanting and I think I need to be thinking about this or praying for that, but it's very interesting what comes into the consciousness, and it's always the right thing that, whether it's an answer or the next step I need to take. But basically, it is a complicated question, obviously, depending on circumstances, and there's no one sort of size fits all. But again, to go back to how Buddhists view it, we have this concept of human revolution, which means, a change in our inner reality affects everything on the outside, and it's this constant questioning coupled with prayer and chanting that comes together and takes us in the right direction. And again, I agree with what Rose is saying. I don't feel there's any other way to approach life or philanthropy without the sort of structure or the compass, if you will, that any faith gives you. I think that, it's not necessarily about being this or being that. I think in this day and age, the biggest issue is that a lot of people don't have a compass or a guiding philosophy. But that can be very, very helpful. And again, it's never let me down.
And one of the questions that came up is something that I know a lot of our bold givers struggle with, and you two are pretty visible in your philanthropy, Rose. I know you write articles and you host workshops through harvest time and have a strong grounding with your community. And Anjhula, you've got your foundation and your work. But a lot of people struggle with this in how do you challenge or encourage and support your peers who aren't giving at the same level, who, as Anjhula said, they're buying cars, they're, whatever their priorities are. How can you support your peers and colleagues and others to be as generous and open-hearted as you two both are?
Yeah, Rose, I'm looking at you, you're looking at me. I'll go first, no problem.
But you go first and then mix it up.
Well, first of all, I think that's a great question because, we always want to be a positive, I call it humanitarian competition. Instead of who's carrying whatever bag or car, sort of, this is positive peer pressure, if you will. So it's a good question. But again, I'd be mindful that, coming from a Buddhist perspective, we believe, of course, in the inherent dignity in every single human being, the right to live, the right to be respected. But, based on concepts of past life or karma, the playing field is not even for everyone. Especially if you're looking at it from a sort of secular, materialistic point of view. My advice would be, everyone, wherever they're starting is right for them. To encourage them to do the best that they can. I mean, it's exactly what Babi was saying. It's apples and oranges. If someone's having a Mercedes and, someone's struggling to make ends meet or pay rent, it's not about how much. I would concentrate just on the how. And before, when people have asked me, like, especially in India with the sort of abject poverty and being a third world country, sometimes we can't give in a material way, but there's so many things that are free, starting mainly with prayer, but also in how you speak to someone, how you look at someone, how you engage with someone. I believe it raises the collective consciousness in a higher vibration. So it's fine to have a friendly, like I said, humanitarian competition, but that can easily... But there's another perspective you can almost say, like, a lot of times I see also on the other hand of the spectrum of, very high social economic strata, a lot of times that giving is motivated by, well, they gave, this much, and I'm going to try to top it. What do you say? A means to an end. I don't think the people who are getting malaria nets would necessarily be complaining, but having said that, as a Buddhist, intention's very important. So, just start where you are. Don't worry about how much or what the next person is doing. And try your best always. And maybe a little more every day, sort of compete with yourself would be my starting point.
Thank you. And I know also that, we have this conversation with some of our bold givers who find it rather lonely because their peers don't share their value systems. These are people who want to change the world. They don't want to go to a cocktail party and a gala. They want to buy an ambulance for Liberia and really touch people. So I know this can be a lonely journey as well. People always assume that if you've got wealth that you don't have those experiences. But Rose, do you want to share a little bit about your thoughts here?
Yeah, just to go back to the question for a second, I was smiling and listening to the question because I feel like I have two different ways I could respond. I mean, one is that, through my work in Harvest Time, I get to know a lot of people who are like me. In fact, I was drawn to Harvest Time because I was one of the people that you just mentioned, lonely. I had these instincts and these desires that nobody else around me seemed to have. And I didn't understand why, because they seemed obvious to me, just going to church on Sunday, that we had to think about this stuff, but I didn't know why nobody else was thinking about it. And so, that's how I came to Harvest Time. So now I get to be inside of an organization where those are the people who come to us. And so that's sort of the easy place, is just to be with people and build community among people who share this longing. Much harder is living in my neighborhood, and where people are not necessarily have that as a desire. And so that's where I hear the question coming from. And I have a part of me that really wants to sort of change people. So that's here, and welcome. That's a part of me, and I have to say, it's really not effective. And so I feel like what's much more effective. I was really struck by something Anjhula said earlier, which is, if you change yourself, it shifts the vibration around you. I don't know if I got your words exactly right, but I think really the most important thing is to work. I try to keep my focus right here on me. And what I notice is that the people who are interested in this path then are drawn to me, because I think there is sort of like a magnetic energy that happens. Yep. And in terms of folks who are not interested in this journey, mostly I think in my better moments, I just try to see people for the good that's in them. And I feel like to see the spirit of the individuals and to really see that and be in response to that, I think is what enables people to trust that part of themselves. So as much as, I'm working all the time, as much as I am tempted to judge people or think they should be doing something different, I just feel like that just doesn't work. And much more effective is to see the good that is in them, and to just be in relationship to that. But even more than that, I feel like I try to keep the focus right here, and then trust that the universe brings to me the people who we are to journey together. And I have to say, it's not like I'm supporting them. It's absolutely a mutual support. Like, we are building a community of people who share this desire for money to be in service in the world. And so anytime somebody comes into my life, that my life might some way be inspiring to them, I just feel like it's the law of the universe that person also inspires me. So and actually I have to say, that's one of my places of, one of my core beliefs about giving is, how do you know when it's a sacred gift? Is because the gift is going in every direction. So in philanthropy, it can be easy to think that giving is moving from me to help someone else. And I just feel like, I don't think that's true. I think it is an exchange, a dance. It's much more like that. And so I try to focus less on making other people do something. I absolutely have that part of me, so welcome. But I really just try as much as I can to work with myself, and then trust that the people come who we're meant to journey together in this life. And I'm on this call, I talk about what I'm doing. So it's not just that I'm working on myself, but I'm also been willing to talk about it. So that is a way that I'm trying to make it more easier for people to be in this kind of a journey and know that there's other people who are on it. Because I think when I first started, when I was 21, I felt deeply alone. And what I know now that I'm 44 is that there is a whole movement of people in the world, a huge web. Right. We may not be the dominant voice of society, but we are not alone. We are part of something that's a huge web that I think, just from my worldview, that the Spirit is doing. So when I put my voice out there and share my story, it's simply because I want that web. I want us to find each other. But I just find it's much more effective for me to work here and just talk very personally about what's true for me, and share that, so people who are drawn to that journey, that we can find each other.
Thank you. You said something. Go ahead, Anjhula.
I was just going to say, that was amazing to hear what you're saying, Rose. It's absolutely right. We may not be in the majority, but even miles away, I can feel what you're saying. I think it's a conscious minority that wields a lot of power, and I don't mean power in a conventional sense. And absolutely, if someone asks me, I'm just chuckling because, you're saying, well, this is just the way I am, and I'm kind of wondering why everyone else around me was or is not, and that's my story too. But I'll just make a quick reference. I think, we live in an age of 1 hour dry cleaning, 1 hour photography, everything snappy snap and like just there. I think we also need to slow down and we kind of slow down to go faster. We need to be okay with the fact that we just may move the needle a centimeter, but for future generations and pay it forward. And, a lot of times we're like, we want to see results, but it's slowly, in a way, plodding along that eventually reaches the masses and great results. And again, Buddhism would concur with what you're saying in the sense that a change in one person can affect tens and thousands. That's all you need.
Rose, you mentioned about it's the right gift when you're giving in every direction. Can you tell us a little bit about what that means to you?
Yeah. So actually, I was thinking about this morning. I went out for a walk very early this morning, and I was here with my son, and Christmas is coming up, and I was just remembering a gift that he made to me a few years ago at Christmas time, and this was maybe one of his first gifts to me, when he first started. So I'm talking about a personal gift. And I remember the Christmas and just his giving me this gift. And I really didn't need to open the gift at all because of just the amount of joy on his face in giving the gift. Like I could have just stopped right there and everything would have been complete, and then I did open the gift, and what he had given me was a pair of slippers, which I'm actually wearing as we're having this conversation. And I loved the slippers because it was exactly what I actually had wanted. And so it was just this, and he was thrilled that I loved it. And it was also a gift that his stepmother helped him to buy. And so it was also a gift from her. So it was just like the gift was moving in so many directions at the same time. So I think when I first started giving, I had this idea in my mind that I had something and I was going to give it to you to solve your problem. Like it was like that. But as I've just been much more conscious in the process of giving and receiving, I don't think that's actually what's happening. I feel like actually there is a love. When love is present in a gift, it's not contained. It's moving every which way. It's like water that's overflowing. And, it nurtures the heart of the one who gives, even as it nurtures the heart of the one who receives. So that's what I meant. And so when I'm in a process of discerning whether there is a gift that I'm to do or not to do, that's actually one of the things I look for, which, can sound a little funny, but really what I'm looking for is there that presence of love that will not be contained, but just wants to move everywhere. And so it will nurture me, even as it nurtures the person that I give to. So it's like that. So that maybe sounds like a self-interest thing, but I just mean it in the sense of, it's one of the signs of how I know that the Spirit is present.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One of the questions that's been posed comes up all the time is, how do you know what's enough? Anjhula, you talk about you're going to hang up your modeling shoes and move on to giving everything to the foundation. And Rose, you've already given away a tremendous amount of your financial gifts. How do you know what's enough, and how do you prepare for the future and retirement and the education of your sons and what might lie ahead? This is a big challenge for all of us.
Yeah. So first of all, I would say, I think of Rilke's letters to a young poet. It's a great question to simply live with. I don't think it's one of those questions that we actually can necessarily get the answer to ahead of time and then we go do it. So in my own experience with that question, I had a certain amount of money that I had in a financial portfolio when I first started giving, and I didn't know how much was enough. Was I supposed to give it all away? Was I supposed to give half? Was I supposed to give 20%? I didn't know, but I just started doing and listening based on what I felt led to in any given moment. And the interesting thing was I came to a point where I knew that was to end. So I didn't know ahead of time that I was going to get there, but I did. And what that figure was for me was to have in somewhat liquid assets what basically amounts to a year's worth of my family's living expenses. That was my answer to the question. But I feel like everybody has their own. You know, I live in a tradition where there is definitely a call to live in poverty. I do not live in poverty. So to have a year's worth of our family's needs in the bank, many people in my life would consider that wealthy. So that's what my answer was to that question. But I feel like, and I should be clear that there's other things that I have that are not liquid. So I'm only speaking there about the liquid part. But I feel like my response to the question is it's a great question to live. And each person is going to have their own answer. So I think I think there is a desire to know what it is, but I would shy away from that and say, just live the question and keep asking yourself, how much is enough? It's a great question. And even, that comes into play, just right now in our household, we're in preparation for Christmas. How much is enough to give to our family? Just sit with the question and listen. I feel, again, I want to go back to what Anjhula said, is that our intuition, our spiritual sensors, I think know when we listen to them. And each person's answer, I think, is different. So the questions about retirement and kids' college, those are other questions that I know we don't have time for, but I also feel like absolutely I sit with those too.
Thank you. Anjhula, anything to add?
Just, I would say, of course, there's, probably a pragmatic way of approaching that as well as a spiritual. I mean, for me personally, before I got married, if I lost my job, just, for me, I would feel that having 6 months worth of, rent money in the bank, so I could find another job and, sort of be okay was enough from, a sort of secular point of view. But just like Rose said, you will know the answer. It's a very contextual thing. It's highly unique and personalized to each person's situation, gender, environment. For me, it's very interesting. I knew, like Babi was saying, in the future, any check that comes through, any modeling or acting assignment, I will just give to our foundation. I think it's very important to sit with the feeling you have when you're giving it away. Are you coming from a place of fear or are you coming from a place of abundance? You start sort of like holding on to that check and I don't want to give in, there's resentment, or is it just flowing? So sit with that, ask yourself that each time, tinker with it, and you will find the right formula for yourself. And then it's really funny, when I've done that, and again, I think Rose sort of alluded to that earlier, sort of surrendering and listening to one's higher consciousness, it's very surprising the abundance that has come back. And like she was saying, like that love and that energy, it just comes in different forms, but it can't be destroyed. And it's just amazing how it circularly works. So that's been my experience.
Thank you. And I knew we weren't going to have nearly enough time, but it's really been a pleasure talking with both of you. I'm going to just thank you, and then I'm going to have Rose do the closing thought-provoking question of the day or thought for the holiday season. But I just want to thank you both. It's been an honor and a privilege, and I will cherish this time that we've had together across the continents. And this will be available on the website, and we'll send out an email, as I said, with any follow-up of the links we talked about today. And from all of us at Boulder Giving, we wish everyone a joyous holiday and inspirational philanthropy throughout the new year. And Rose, if you would like to close our session, that would be wonderful.
So yes, and at first I just have to say thank you to Boulder Giving for bringing visibility to this incredible web that we're in today from New York and California and India. I mean, that's what we were talking about. So thank you for making it visible today. Just as a way of something to take with you, and I know these last few weeks of the year are a time where many of the religious traditions are engaged in a practice of giving and receiving. And we've been talking a lot today about our giving and how we think about that. So my invitation, as I was just pondering, what might we take with us from this conversation? My invitation to all of us on the call is, as we enter into these last days, to be particularly conscious of our receiving. I actually believe that the being able to give in a spirit of great love, in order to do that, we need to be able to receive. And receiving can be quite vulnerable. So my invitation is simply, whether it's a gift that comes from your family, or it's a surprise sunrise on your way to work, or a rainbow in the sky, whatever it is, to be particularly aware of the gifts and then that are coming to you, and then just to note, allow it to really sink into your heart, to savor it like a really wonderful glass of wine or piece of chocolate, just to let it sink in, because receiving can open a place of vulnerability, and we want to kind of close it fast. Don't close it. Just stay there.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. And thank you for everyone on the call. There were some wonderful questions today. And so
thank you.
Wishing everyone all
Thank
the very
you for
best.
having us.
It was a pleasure.